Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And I hope you guys are enjoying the reading. I think this book is really good. I'm enjoying it a lot. I think they should have it as a textbook and probably well, maybe high school, right? Required reading for high school and for the financial classes, right? All right. So this will be, we're going to be reading chapter 13, and this is part two. So I'm just going to move the camera in. If you have a book, you can follow with us with your book. If not, you can follow us here on the screen, whichever works for you. And check out our other book clubs as well. We have the Health Book Club on Wednesdays. What else? Spiritual book clubs on Mondays. So check them out. Okay, roundtable agents in Russia. In Russia, prior to and during the revolution, there were many local observers, tourists, and newsmen who reported that British and American agents were everywhere, particularly in Petrograd, providing money for insurrection. One report said, for example, that British agents were seen handing out 25 ruble notes to the men at the Pavlovsky Regiment just a few hours before it mutinied against its officers and sided with the revolution. The subsequent publication of various memoirs and documents made it clear that this funding was provided by Milner and channeled through Sir George Buchanan, who was the British ambassador to Russia at that time. And that quote was from C. Degolovich, page 230. It was a repeat of the ploy that had worked so well for the cabal many times in the past. Roundtable members were once again working both sides of the conflict to weaken and topple a target government. Tsar Nicholas had every reason to believe that since the British were Russia's allies in the war against Germany, British officials would be the last persons on earth to conspire against him. Yet, the British ambassador himself represented the hidden group which was financing the regime's downfall. The roundtable agents from America did not have the advantage of using the diplomatic service as a cover, and therefore had to be considerably more ingenious. They came not as diplomats or even as interested businessmen, but disguised as Red Cross officials on a humanitarian mission. The group consisted almost entirely of financiers, lawyers, and accountants from New York banks and investment houses. They simply had overpowered the American Red Cross organization with large contributions and, in effect, purchased a franchise to operate in its name. Professor Sutton tells us the 1910 Red Cross fundraising campaign for $2 million, for example, was successful only because it was supported by these wealthy residents of New York City. J.P. Morgan himself contributed $100,000. Henry P. Davison, a Morgan partner, was chairman of the 1910 New York Fundraising Committee and later became chairman of the War Council of the American Red Cross. The Red Cross was unable to cope with the demands of World War I and, in effect, was taken over by these New York bankers. And that quote was from Sutton, Revolution, page 72. For the duration of the war, the Red Cross had been made nominally a part of the armed forces and subject to orders from the proper military authorities. It was not clear who these authorities were, and in fact, uh, there were never any orders, but the arrangement made it possible for the participants to receive military commissions and wear the uniform of American Army officers. The entire expense of the Red Cross mission in Russia, including the purchase of uniforms, was paid for by the man who was appointed by President Wilson to become its head, quote, Colonel William Boyce Thompson. Thompson was a classical specimen of the Round Table Network, having begun his career as a spectacular in as a speculator Close enough, spectacular. Speculator in copper mines, he soon moved into the world of high finance. He refinanced the American Woolen Company and the Tobacco Products Company, launched the Cuban Cane Sugar Company, purchased, they're all cartels, if you notice, tobacco, sugar, I'm sure wool too, but anyways, purchased controlling interest in the Pierce Arrow Motor Car Company, organized the Submarine Boat Corporation and the Wright Martin Aeroplane Company, became a director of the Chicago Rock Island and Pacific Railway, the Magna Arizona Railroad, and the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company, was one of the heaviest stockholders in the Chase National Bank, was the regent for JP Morgan's British securities operation, became the first full-time director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, the most important bank in the Federal Reserve System, and, of course, contributed $250,000 to the Red Cross. When Thompson arrived in Russia, he made it clear that he was not your typical Red Cross representative. According to Herman Hedgedorn, the Thompson's biographer, he deliberately created the kind of setting which would be expected of an American magnate, established himself in established himself in a suite in the Hotel de Europe, Europe, bought a French limousine. Wow, I didn't know limousine comes in French. Hmm, interesting. I wonder what that looks like. Went dutifully to receptions and teas and evinced an interest in objects of art. Society and the diplomats, noting that here was a man of parts and power, began to flock to him. He was entertained at the embassies, at the houses of Kerensky's ministers. It was discovered that he was a collector, and those with antiques to sell fluttered around him, offering him miniatures dressed in china, tapestries, even a palace or two. And that was from Herman Hedgedorn, the Magnet, William Bryce Thompson, William Boyce Thompson and His Time. New York, Reynal and Hitchcock, 1935, page 192 to 193. When Thompson attended the opera, he was given the imperial box. People on the street called him the American Czar. And it is not surprising that, according to George Kennan, he was viewed by the Kerensky authorities as the, quote, real ambassador of the United States. And that quote was from George F. Kennan, Russia Leaves the War, Soviet-American Relations, Soviet-American Relations, 1917 to 1920. Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1956, page 60. It is now a matter of record that Thompson syndicated the purchase on Wall Street of Russian bonds in the amount of 10 million rubles. And that was from Hedgedorn, page 192. In addition, he gave over 2 million rubles to Alexander Kerensky for propaganda purposes inside Russia, and with JP Morgan gave the ruble equivalent of $1 million to the Bolsheviks for the spreading of revolutionary propaganda outside of Russia, particularly in Germany and Austria. And that was from Sudden Revolution, page 83 and 91. It was the agitation made possible by this funding that led to the abortive German Spartacus revolt of 1918. C. W.B. Thompson, Red Cross donor, beliefs party misrepresented. Washington Post, February 2nd, 1918. A paragraph of the cablegram from Morgan to Thompson advising that the money had been transferred to the National City Bank branch in Petrograd is included in this book. An object lesson in South Africa. At first, it may seem incongruous that the Morgan Group would provide funding for both Kerensky and Lenin. These men may have both been socialist revolutionaries, but they were miles apart in their plans for the future, and in fact were bitter competitors for control of the new government. But the tactic of funding both sides in the political contest by then had been refined by members of the Round Table into a fine art. A stunning example of this occurred in South Africa during the outset of the Boer War in 1899. And if I'm not mistaken, Boer means white men, I think. Boer. The British and Dutch had been active in the settlement of southern Africa for decades. The Dutch had developed the provinces of Transvaal and the Orange Free State, while the British had colonized such areas as Rhodesia, Cape Hope, Basutoland, Swaziland, and Bechuanaland. Conflict was inevitable between these two groups of settlers whenever they found themselves in competition for the resources of the same territory. But it was the discovery of gold in the Whitewater area of the Transvaal that provided the motive for war. Politically, the Transvaal was in the hands of the Boers, who were the descendants of the Dutch settlers. But after the discovery of gold in that area, the minefields had been developed primarily by the British and became solidly under their control. Not surprisingly, one of the largest players in that game was Cecil Rhodes, who already had monopolized the diamond fields under British control to the south. Historian Henry Pike tells us, with the discovery of gold in the Transvaal, Rhodes' greed became passionate. His hatred for Paul Kruger, the Afrikaner president of the Transvaal, knew no limits. Boy, that's a tongue twister, especially when your mouth is kind of dry. He was bitterly opposed to Kruger's independent Transvaal and viewed this as the main obstacle to his efforts to sweep all southern Africa under British rule. And that quote was from Henry R. Pike, PhD, A History of Communism in South Africa, Germiston, South Africa, Christian Mission International of South Africa, 1985, page 39. In 1895, excuse me for a minute, my allergies acting up a bit here. Okay. All right, sorry about that. In 1895, Rhodes set in motion a plan to overthrow Kruger's government by organizing an uprising among the British inhabitants in Johannesburg. Johannesburg. The uprising was financed by himself and was to be led by his brother Frank and other loyal supporters. This was to be followed by a military invasion of the Transvaal by British troops from Bechuanaland and Rhodesia led by Sir Leander Jameson. The uprising fizzled and ended in Jameson's arrest and public disgrace. But Rhodes was determined to have the Transvaal and began immediately to prepare a second, more patient ploy. Through Rhodes' influence, Lord Alfred Milner was appointed as the British High Commissioner of South Africa. In London, Lord Esher, another member of the secret society, became the chief political advisor to King Edward and was in daily contact with him throughout this period. That took care of the British side of the contest. With regard to the Boers side, Professor Quigley tells the amazing story. By a process whose details are still obscure, a brilliant young graduate of Cambridge, Jan Smuts, who had been a vigorous supporter of Rhodes and acted as his agent in Kimberley, South Africa's largest diamond mine, as late as 1895, and who was one of the most important members of the Rhodes Milner Group in the period 1908 to 1950, went to the Transvaal went to the Transvaal and by violent anti-British agitation became state secretary of that country, although a British subject, and chief political advisor to President Kruger. Milner made provocative troop movements on the Boer frontiers in spite of the vigorous protests of his commanding general in South Africa, who had to be removed. And finally, war was precipitated when Smuts drew up an ultimatum insisting that the British troop movement cease, and when this was rejected by Milner. And that was from Quigley, Tragedy, page 137, 138. And so, as a result of careful engineering by roundtable members on both sides, one making outrageous demands and the other responding to those demands in pretended indignation. It's a theater, isn't it? I sometimes wonder if what's happening in the current geopolitical uh, arena right now is the same thing, theater. I don't know, just a thought. The war finally began with a British invasion in October of 1899. After 2.5 years of fierce fighting, the Boers were forced to surrender, and Milner administered the former republic as a militarily occupied territory. Roundtable members, known to the public as, quote, Milner's kindergarten, were placed into all key government posts, and the gold fields were finally secured, placing bets on all horses. On the other side of the world, in New York City, the same tactic of playing both sides against each other was being applied with brilliant precision by Roundtable member J.P. Morgan. Professor Quigley tells us, to Morgan, all political parties were simply organizations to be used, and the firm always was careful to keep a foot in all camps. Morgan himself, Dwight Morrow, and other partners were allied with Republicans. Russell C. Leffingwell was allied with the Democrats. Grayson Murphy was allied with the with the extreme right, and Thomas W. Lamont was allied with the left. And that's IBIT page 945. Although it is true that Thomas Lamont was the father of Corliss Lamont, a well-known communist, he was himself widely regarded as a man of leftist persuasions. It must also be remembered that he felt equally at home among the fascists and, in fact, served as an official business consultant for Mussolini in the 1920s. And that was from C. John P. Diggins, Mussolini and Fascism, The View from America. Excuse me. Oh boy, I burped. Burped my coffee. Excuse me. That was Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 1972. At the same time that Morgan was funding pro-Bolshevik groups, he founded what was probably the most virulent anti-Bolshevik organization ever to exist in America. It was called United Americans, and it set about to frighten everyone into believing that the Red Mob was at that very moment poised to capture New York City. It issued shocking reports warning about a pending financial collapse, widespread starvation, and a desperate working class being maneuvered into accepting communist slogans and rhetoric as a last resort. Ironically, the officers of this organization were Alan Walker of the Guarantee Trust Company, which was then acting as the Soviets' fiscal agent in the US. Daniel Willard, president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railway, which was then active in the development of Soviet railways, H. Westinghouse of Westinghouse Air Brake Company, which was then operating a major plant in Russia, and Otto H. Kahn of Kuhn, Loeb and Company, which was one of the principal financial backers of the fledgling Soviet regime. And that was from Sudden Revolution, page 163 to 168. Even inside Russia itself, the Round Table was spreading its bets. In addition to the funding previously mentioned, which was given to the Bolsheviks and to their opponents, the Mensheviks, Morgan also financed the military forces of Admiral Kolchak, who was fighting against the Bolsheviks in Siberia. Not surprisingly, Kolchak also received funding from a consortium of British financiers, including Alfred Milner. And that's IBIT page 102, 146, and 166 to 167. It is commonly stated that the original intent of the Red Cross mission to Moscow was to prevent the Russian government from making a separate peace with Germany, which would release German troops to fight against England and France. According to that version of the story, which portrays the actor as patriots, merely doing what was best for the war effort, the first goal was to support the Tsar. When the Tsar was overthrown, they supported the Mensheviks because they had pledged to stay in the war. When the Mensheviks were ousted, they continued to support the Bolsheviks in order to gain sufficient influence to convince them not to give aid to Germany. It takes a great deal of gullibility to swallow that line. A far more plausible reading is that the Morgan interests were merely doing what they had always done, placing bets on all horses so that no matter which one crossed the finish line, the winner would be obligated to them. British agent of the Round Table. After the Bolsheviks had seized power in Russia, Sir George Buchanan was recalled as the British ambassador and replaced by a member, was recalled as the British ambassador and replaced by a member of Milner's kindergarten. Interesting title, a kindergarten. Wow. Why not college or university or high school? Interesting word, use of words. Uh, Anyways, Milner's kindergarten, a young man by the name of Bruce Lockhart. In his book, British Agent, Lockhart describes the circumstances of his assignment. Speaking of a meeting with Prime Minister Lloyd George, he wrote, I saw that his own mind was made up. He had been greatly impressed, as Lord Milner told me afterwards, by an interview with Colonel Thompson of the American Red Cross, who had just returned from Russia and who had denounced in blunt language the folly of the Allies in not opening up negotiations with the Bolsheviks. 3 days later, all my doubts were put at rest. I was to go to Russia as head of a special mission to establish unofficial relations with the Bolsheviks. I had been selected for this Russian mission not by the foreign secretary, but by the war cabinet, actually by Lord Milner and Mr. Lloyd George. Lord Milner, I saw almost daily. 5 days before my departure, I dined alone with him at Brooks. He was in his most inspiring mood. He talked to me with a charming frankness about the war, about the future of England, about his own career, and about the opportunities of youth. He was too very far from being the jingo and the conservative reactionary whom popular opinion at one time represented him to be. On the contrary, many of his views on society were startlingly modern. He believed in a highly organized state in which service, efficiency, and hard work were more important than titles or money bags. And that quote was from R.H. Bruce Lockhart, British agent, New York and London, G.P. Putnam's Sons, 1933, page 198 to 199, 204, and page 206 and 207. American agent of the Round Table. When Thompson returned to the United States, the man he selected to replace himself as head of the American Red Cross mission was his second in command, Raymond Robbins. Not much is known about Robbins, except that he was the protege of Colonel Edward Mandell House, and he might have been remained an obscure player in this drama had it not been for the fact that he became one of the central characters in Bruce Lockhart's book. It is there that we get this inside view Another new acquaintance of these first days in the Bolshevized St. Petersburg was Raymond Robbins, the head of the American Red Cross mission. He had been a leading figure in Roosevelt's Bull Moose campaign for the American presidency in 1912. Although a rich man himself, he was an anti-capitalist. Hitherto, his two heroes had been Roosevelt and Cecil Rhodes. Now, Lenin had captured his imagination. Robbins was the only man whom Lenin was always willing to see, and who ever succeeded in imposing his own personality on the unemotional Bolshevik leader. In a less official sense, Robbins had a similar mission to my own. He was an intermediary between the Bolsheviks and the American government, and had set himself the task of persuading President Wilson to recognize the Soviet regime. And that was from Lockhart, page 220. What an amazing revelation is contained in those words. First, we learn that Robbins was a leader in the team effort that threw the election of 1912 to Woodrow Wilson. Then we learn that he was an anti-capitalist. Third, we discover that an anti-capitalist can hero worship Cecil Rhodes. Then we see the tremendous power he wielded over Lenin. And finally, we were told that although he was part of a private group financed by Wall Street bankers, he was in reality the intermediary between the Bolsheviks and the American government. One will look in vain for a better summary. The fact that Cecil Rhodes was one of Robbins' great heroes has special significance for this story. It was not merely an intellectual infatuation from college days. On the night before he left Russia, Robbins dined with Lockhart. Describing the occasion, Lockhart says, quote, he had been reading Rhodes' life, and after dinner he gave us a wonderful exposition of Rhodes' character, unquote. And that's from IBIT, page 270. Thus, both Lockhart and Robbins were dedicated disciples of Cecil Rhodes, and both were undoubtedly part of the international network to which Professor Quigley alluded, possibly even members of the Round Table. Lockhart reported to the British group while Robbins reported to the American group, and both were clearly working for identical objectives and doing the work of the unseen hand. The Bolsheviks were well aware of the power these men represented, and there was no door closed to them. They were allowed to attend meetings of the Central Executive Committee and were consulted regarding important decisions. Now, the quote, the footnote on Executive Committee was IBIT 250, page 253. And the footnote for important decisions was from the U.S. State Department decimal file, 861/3449. But perhaps the best way to appraise the extent of the influence these capitalists had over the anti-capitalists is to let Lockhart tell us his own story. In his memoirs, he wrote, I returned from our interview to our flat to find an urgent message from Robbins requesting me to come to see him at once. I found him in a state of great agitation. He had been in conflict with Salkind, a nephew of Trotsky and then assistant commissar for foreign affairs. Salkind had been rude, and the American, who had a promise from Lenin that whatever happened, a train would always be ready for him at an hour's notice, was determined to exact an apology or to leave the country. When I arrived, he had just finished telephoning to Lenin. He had delivered his ultimatum, and Lenin had promised to give a reply within 10 minutes. I waited while Robbins fumed. Then the telephone rang, and Robbins picked up the receiver. Lenin had capitulated. Salkind was dismissed from his post. But he was an old member of the party. Would Robbins have any objection if Lenin sent him a Bolshevik emissary to burn? Robbins smiled grimly. "Thank you, Mr. Lennon," he said. "As I can't send the son of a bitch to hell, bum is the next thing you can do with him." Oh, burn, sorry. Burn. Burn is the next thing you can. Burn is the next best thing you can do with him. And that quote was from Lockhart, page 225 to 226. Such was the raw power over the leaders of communism that was concealed behind the innocent facade of the American Red Cross mission. And yet, the world, even today, has no inkling of its reality. It has been a carefully guarded secret, and even many of those who were close to it were unable to see it. The assistant to William Thompson in Russia was Cornelius Kelleher. Kel- Kelleher. Keller. Keller? Keller. In later years, reflecting on the naivete of Dr. Franklin Billings, who was head of the mission's medical team, Keller wrote, "Poor Mr. Billings believed he was in charge of a scientific mission for the relief of Russia. He was in reality nothing but a mask. The Red Cross complexion of the mission was nothing but a mask." And that quote was from Keenan, Russia, page 59. The purpose of a mask, of course, is to conceal. And so we are led to ask the question, what was behind that mask? What were the true motives and goals of the masqueraders? We shall turn to that subject next. Summary. The Bolshevik Revolution was not a spontaneous uprising of the masses. Oops, sorry about that. Little off-centered there. The Bolshevik Revolution was not a spontaneous uprising of the masses. It was planned, financed, and orchestrated by outsiders. Some of the financing came from Germany, which hoped that internal problems would force Russia out of the war against her. But most of the money and leadership came from financiers in England and the United States. It was a perfect example of the Rothschild formula in action. This group centered mainly around a secret society created by Cecil Rhodes, one of the world's wealthiest men at the time. The purpose of that group was nothing less than world domination and the establishment of a modern feudalist society controlled by the world's central banks. Headquartered in England, the Rhodes' innermost directorate was called the Round Table. In other countries, there were established subordinate structures called Round Table groups. The Round Table Group in the United States became known as the Council on Foreign Relations. The CFR, which was initially dominated by J.P. Morgan and later by the Rockefellers, is the most powerful group in America today. It is even more powerful than the federal government because almost all of the key positions in government are held by its members. In other words, it is the United States government. Agents of these two groups cooperated closely in pre-revolutionary Russia, and particularly after the Tsar was overthrown. The American contingent in Russia disguised itself as a Red Cross mission, allegedly doing humanitarian work. Cashing in on their close friendship with Trotsky and Lenin, they obtained profitable business concessions from the new government, which returned their initial investments many times over. Ah, here is a picture. I'm going to move the camera out a little bit so you could see it more fully. Oops. Okay. Above, right here, is the Red Cross mission in Moscow shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution. So left to right, let me see here. Left to right. Let's see. That is J.W. Andrews. That's Raymond Robbins. That is Alan Wardell. That's D. Haywood Hardy. Oh, wait, 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, okay. So sorry, try again. J.W. Andrews, Raymond Robbins, Alan Wardell, D. Haywood Hardy. So I wonder who this guy is. Maybe he's just the driver. the chauffeur. Under the pretense of humanitarianism, the mission's key personnel were Wall Street financiers following their own agenda for acquiring profitable commercial concessions from the new government. They heavily financed all factions of the revolutionary movement to be sure of gaining influence with whatever group should come out on top. Hmm. Now, down here is another picture, and this is a cablegram. This picture is a cablegram from J.P. Morgan to William Boyce Thompson, head of the Red Cross mission prior to Robbins, advising that $1 million had been transferred to Thompson via the National City Bank. There were many such infusions of, quote, capitalist money into the new communist regime. The process continues to this day. Interesting, eh? As I was reading these chapters, it's almost like a movie playing. Interesting, huh? And that's the end of chapter 13. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. And we'll continue our reading next time with a new chapter. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, and we'll see you next week. Okay, bye-bye now.